Don't ignore this psalm, not because it is famous, not because people quote it, but because tonight your heart feels heavy, and you don't even know how to explain why. You smiled today. You answered messages. You did what was expected of you. But inside, something felt tight, crowded, noisy, thoughts stacking on top of thoughts, worries replaying the same questions. What if this doesn't work out? What if I'm already too late? What if I'm carrying more than I can handle? If your heart is heavy right now, listen carefully. This psalm is not random. You did not arrive here by accident. There are moments when anxiety doesn't shout. It whispers. It presses. It sits quietly on your chest and refuses to move. And the hardest part is this: you can't explain it to anyone, because on the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, your mind feels like it never rests. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. Before we go any further, do something simple with me. Take a slow breath, not to relax, not to escape, but to arrive, because this moment matters. You're not weak for feeling this way. You're human. Even David, the one who wrote this psalm, reached a moment where his thoughts overwhelmed him. Psalm 55 was written from a place of deep mental weight, not physical danger, not visible wounds, but inner pressure, emotional exhaustion, a mind that could not find silence. And that's why this psalm still speaks today, because anxiety hasn't changed, fear hasn't changed, the weight on the heart hasn't changed, only the noise has. Notifications, deadlines, bills, expectations, fear about tomorrow. And when the noise gets too loud, the soul begins to feel heavy. David didn't pretend he was strong. He said this: "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me." That's not poetic exaggeration. That's honesty. That's what anxiety feels like. A heart that can't settle. A mind that can't rest. Thoughts that won't slow down. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. David didn't hide his anxiety from God. He brought it directly to him. Not cleaned up, not organized, not calm, just real. And maybe that's what you need tonight. Not another strategy, not another explanation, not another attempt to be strong, but permission to bring the weight exactly as it is. This psalm does not rush peace. It walks you toward it, slowly, safely, one breath at a time. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because the God who listened to David's overwhelmed mind is listening to yours right now. And as we continue, you'll hear words written by someone who felt trapped inside his own thoughts and found a way to release them, not by force, not by denial, but by surrender. Stay here. Don't scroll. Don't rush. This psalm was written for moments like this. And if your heart is heavy, this is only the beginning. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety does something very specific to the mind. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it circles, the same thoughts returning again and again, the same fears wearing different faces, the same questions with no clear answers. David understood that feeling. He wasn't running from enemies in this psalm. He wasn't hiding in caves. He was trapped inside his own thoughts. And he said something that many people are afraid to admit. I am restless, my complaint, and I moan. That word, restless, matters. It means he could not settle. He could not calm his inner world. Even in silence, his mind was loud. If your heart is heavy tonight, you know that feeling. You lie down, but your mind stays awake. You try to pray, but your thoughts interrupt you. You want peace, but peace feels just out of reach. David didn't pretend faith erased that struggle. Instead, he named it fear, trembling, overwhelming thoughts. He didn't feel ashamed of his anxiety. He brought it into the presence of God. That's important, because many people think prayer requires calm. But Psalm 55 teaches something different. Prayer begins with honesty. David said, fear and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. This is not a polished prayer. This is a heart speaking under pressure. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because it gives you permission to stop pretending you're okay. You don't have to silence your thoughts before coming to God. You don't have to fix your anxiety first. You don't have to organize your feelings. You come as you are, heavy, tired, mentally crowded. And here's where this psalm shifts. David doesn't stay trapped in describing his pain. He moves toward release. He says, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. That sentence is powerful because anxiety often creates a desire to escape, to disappear, to run from responsibility, to find somewhere quiet where the mind can finally breathe. David felt that too, and instead of judging himself for it, he expressed it. God was not offended by David's desire for rest. God was listening. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because rest is not weakness. It is a need. The soul was never designed to carry constant pressure. David didn't say, I want to be stronger. He said, I want to rest. That tells us something essential. Anxiety is not always a lack of faith. Sometimes it is the soul asking for refuge. And Psalm 55 points to where that refuge is found. David doesn't escape his life. He escapes into God. He says, evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. That's not a one-time prayer. That's ongoing. Morning, midday, night, again and again. This is how anxiety loosens its grip, not by disappearing instantly, but by being released repeatedly. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because it teaches you that you are allowed to return to God as many times as you need. You don't bother him with your thoughts. You don't exhaust him with your fears. He hears. And as we continue, you'll see how this psalm moves from mental overload to inner stability, not suddenly, not magically, but faithfully. Stay with me. This psalm is still working. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety has a way of convincing you that you are carrying everything alone. It tells you that no one really understands, that no one sees the full weight, that you have to stay strong, silent, composed. But Psalm 55 quietly dismantles that lie. David doesn't isolate himself from God. He leans closer. He says, "He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage. For many are arrayed against me." Notice something important here. The battle David describes is not physical. It's internal. A battle of thoughts, of pressure, of emotional strain. And yet he speaks of safety, not the absence of battle, but protection within it. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. Because God does not wait for your life to become quiet before offering peace. He offers peace in the middle of noise. David understood that anxiety feels like being surrounded by worries, surrounded by expectations, surrounded by fears that don't give you space to breathe. But he also understood something deeper. He was not surrounded alone. And that realization begins to shift the tone of the psalm, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. David begins to redirect his focus, not away from his pain, but toward the one who carries it. He says, "Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you." That sentence is simple, but it's not passive. Cast means release, throw, hand over intentionally. It does not mean deny the burden exists. It means refusing to carry it alone. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety often stays. When burdens remain unspoken, unshared, unreleased. And this psalm offers a clear invitation, not to solve everything, not to control tomorrow, but to transfer the weight. You were never meant to carry every outcome. You were never meant to manage every fear. You were never meant to hold every unanswered question. David didn't carry his burden quietly. He placed it deliberately into God's hands. And here's what happens next. The psalm does not say the burden disappears. It says God sustains you. That matters. Sustain means support, strengthen, hold steady. Sometimes peace is not the removal of pressure, but the assurance that you will not collapse under it. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because sustaining grace often arrives before circumstances change. David's world didn't suddenly become easier, but his soul became steadier. And that's the turning point. Not when fear vanishes, but when fear no longer controls you. As we move forward, you'll see how this psalm continues to ground the mind, not by escaping reality, but by anchoring the heart. Stay here. You're not carrying this alone. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety doesn't disappear the moment you pray. It loosens slowly, like a knot being untied, one thread at a time. Psalm 55 understands that process. David does not suddenly sound fearless. He sounds steadier, and that difference matters. There's a quiet strength that forms when the heart stops resisting reality and starts trusting God with it. David says, "But I call to God, and the Lord will save me." Notice the simplicity. No long explanations. No dramatic declarations. Just a decision. I call to God. Anxiety often pulls you in the opposite direction. It tells you to stay inside your thoughts, to rehearse worst-case scenarios, to replay conversations that haven't happened yet. But David interrupts that pattern. He calls out, again and again and again. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because calling to God is not about eloquence. It's about direction. You choose where your attention rests. Not perfectly, not permanently, but intentionally. David continues, evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. That repetition is not accidental. Morning anxiety feels different from night anxiety. Midday pressure carries its own weight, and David brings all of it, not just the dramatic moments, the quiet ones too. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because God does not grow tired of hearing the same fear more than once. You're not repeating yourself to him. You're processing with him, and slowly something shifts. David begins to see more clearly. Anxiety clouds perception. It distorts reality. It magnifies threats and minimizes hope. But prayer recenters the mind, not by ignoring danger, but by restoring perspective. David says, God will hear and humble them, he who is enthroned from of old. This is not arrogance. It is grounding. David remembers who God is, not a distant observer, not a passive listener, but one who reigns beyond the chaos. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety shrinks your world until fear feels larger than God. Psalm 55 gently reverses that. It lifts your eyes without forcing your emotions. David doesn't say he feels fearless. He says he trusts. And trust does not require emotional calm. It requires surrender. That's the difference. You can trust God while your heart is still racing, while your mind is still crowded, while answers are still unclear. Trust is not the absence of anxiety. It is a decision to place it somewhere safe. As we move deeper into this psalm, you'll notice something subtle. David's words become less frantic, more grounded, more anchored, not because life became easy, but because his focus changed. Stay with me. This psalm is still working on the weight you're carrying. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety often convinces you that you must understand everything before you can feel peace. But Psalm 55 teaches something quieter. Peace does not come from understanding. It comes from placement, where you place your trust, where you place your attention, where you place the weight of what you cannot control. David continues speaking, but now there is less urgency in his voice, not because the problem vanished, but because the pressure shifted. He says, cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved. That phrase, never permit you be moved, does not mean you will never feel shaken. It means you will not be destroyed. Anxiety tells you that one more fear, one more delay, one more disappointment might finally break you. This psalm answers that lie. You may bend, you may feel tired, you may feel overwhelmed, but you will not collapse. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because sustaining grace is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush in dramatically. It holds you steady when you thought you couldn't stand anymore. David's confidence is not emotional excitement. It is settled assurance. And that kind of assurance only comes after release, after you stop gripping every outcome, after you stop replaying every fear, after you stop carrying what was never yours to hold. Anxiety tightens the hands. Faith opens them. David opened his hands. And something else happens here. The psalm begins to separate what belongs to David and what belongs to God. David stops trying to fix everything. He entrusts justice. He entrusts timing. He entrusts outcomes. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety grows when responsibility is misplaced. You are responsible for faithfulness, not for controlling the future. You are responsible for obedience, not for predicting outcomes. You are responsible for bringing your heart to God, not for solving every fear. Psalm 55 gently puts things back in order, and when things are in order, the mind begins to quiet, not instantly, but steadily. David no longer sounds trapped. He sounds anchored. That doesn't mean he stopped feeling. It means his feelings stop leading. There is a difference. As this psalm continues, you'll notice something important. David does not rush away from God. Once he feels a little better, he stays. And that is where anxiety truly loosens its grip. Stay with me. This psalm is still unfolding, and so is the peace it carries. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety doesn't always come from danger. Sometimes it comes from disappointment, from trust that was broken, from expectations that collapsed, from people who were close and suddenly weren't. Psalm 55 touches that place too. David reveals something painful. He says it was not an enemy who wounded him. It was someone familiar, someone he trusted, someone he walked with. This matters because emotional weight often becomes heavier when it comes from betrayal rather than fear. Fear hurts, but betrayal confuses. It makes you question your judgment, your instincts, your ability to trust again. And anxiety feeds on that confusion. David says, "It is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. That is not anger, that is grief." If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because some anxiety is born from wounds that never fully closed, conversations that never happened, apologies that never came, trust that was never restored. David does not minimize that pain. He names it, and by naming it, he stops it from silently controlling him. This is important. Unspoken pain does not disappear. It sinks deeper. Psalm 55 brings it to the surface, where God can meet it. David doesn't seek revenge. He doesn't rehearse bitterness. He releases judgment. He gives God the role. He was never meant to carry himself. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety often increases when you try to carry justice, closure, and healing all at once. You were not designed for that. David understands this. He lets go of what he cannot resolve, and something subtle happens again. The psalm does not become louder. It becomes quieter. There is less explanation, less argument, just trust. David says, "But I will trust in you." That sentence carries weight, not because it sounds strong, but because it is spoken after pain. Trust after pain is different from trust before it. It is deeper, more grounded, less naive. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because trusting God does not mean pretending the wound didn't happen. It means choosing not to let the wound decide your future. As we move forward, this psalm begins to settle into stillness, not emotional numbness, but emotional safety. And that safety is where anxious thoughts finally begin to rest. Stay with me, you're closer to peace than your mind is telling you. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because after pain has been named and trust has been chosen, the soul begins to slow down, not because everything is resolved, but because everything is finally placed where it belongs. Psalm 55 now carries a different rhythm. David is no longer reacting. He is resting. This is important. Anxiety keeps you reacting to thoughts, to memories, to imagined futures. But rest begins when reaction ends. David says, "But I call to God, and the Lord will save me." He is not begging. He is not panicking. He is settled. That doesn't mean his situation changed. It means his inner posture did. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because peace does not come when life becomes predictable. It comes when trust becomes consistent. David repeats his commitment, morning, midday, evening, not because God forgets, but because anxiety returns. And each time it does, David responds the same way. He calls to God. This is the rhythm of peace, not constant calm, but consistent return. Anxiety loses power when it no longer controls where your attention goes. David's attention is no longer trapped inside his fears. It is anchored in God. And then something subtle but powerful happens. David stops explaining himself. He stops analyzing. He simply trusts. There's freedom in that. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because your mind does not need more answers right now. It needs rest. Rest does not mean escape. It means safety. And Psalm 55 creates that space. David knows that even if people fail him, even if circumstances remain uncertain, even if answers take time, God remains steady. That steadiness becomes his anchor. Anxiety thrives in instability. Peace thrives in trust. And trust grows where surrender is practiced. David surrendered daily, repeatedly, without drama, just faithfulness. As this psalm nears its end, there is no loud victory, no celebration, just confidence, quiet confidence. And that kind of confidence is the strongest kind there is. Stay with me. The final movement of this psalm brings everything together and leaves the heart resting, not rushed. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are being held. And that is enough. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety often tells you that peace is fragile. That one wrong thought, one bad moment, one unexpected problem will take everything away. But Psalm 55 gently corrects that fear. David's peace is not built on circumstances. It is built on trust. And trust is not fragile when it is placed in the right hands. David says, God will hear and answer them. That statement is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is certain. Certainty does not always feel exciting. Sometimes it feels quiet. And quiet is exactly what an anxious heart needs. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because your mind has been loud for too long. Loud with worries. Loud with what ifs. loud with pressure to hold everything together. Psalm 55 does not add more noise. It removes it. David no longer argues with his thoughts. He no longer negotiates with fear. He rests in what he knows to be true. God hears. God sustains. God remains. That is enough. Anxiety often comes from trying to predict outcomes, to prepare for every possible future, to prevent pain before it arrives. But this psalm teaches a different posture. Presence. David is no longer living ahead of himself. He is grounded in now, and now is safe. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because peace is found when you stop living 5 steps ahead and return to this moment, this breath, this stillness, this awareness that you are not alone. David does not rush the ending of this psalm. He allows it to settle, and that settling is intentional. An anxious mind needs time to believe that it is safe. Psalm 55 gives it that time, not by force, not by distraction, but by reassurance. God has heard every word, every complaint, every trembling thought, and he has not turned away. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because the God who listened to David is listening to you right now. And as we approach the final movement, there is nothing left to prove, nothing left to explain. Only one thing remains: trust, quiet, steady, enough. Stay here. Let the weight finish lifting at its own pace. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because anxiety often returns. When you think it's finally gone, it comes back quietly, a familiar thought, a small tension in the chest, a question you thought you had already released. Psalm 55 does not deny that reality. Instead, it teaches you how to respond when anxiety knocks again. David does not panic when his thoughts resurface. He does not accuse himself for feeling unsettled again. He simply returns. That is the pattern of this psalm. Return, release, rest, again and again. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because healing is not linear. Some days feel light. Some nights feel heavy again. That does not mean the peace was false. It means the soul is still learning where safety lives. David understood this. That is why he ends the psalm, not with a feeling, but with a choice. He says, "But I will trust in you." Not I feel calm. Not everything makes sense now, but I will trust. Trust is not an emotion. It is a direction, and direction matters. When emotions fluctuate, if your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because you don't need perfect peace to keep moving forward. You need stable trust. Trust gives your mind something solid to rest on when thoughts become unstable. David places trust deliberately, not because life guaranteed safety, but because God did. And that distinction changes everything. Anxiety loses power when your confidence is no longer placed in outcomes you cannot control. It loosens its grip when trust becomes your default response. David knew he could return to God as many times as necessary, and so can you. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because God does not grow impatient with repeated fears. He does not withdraw when the same worry appears again. He remains. That consistency is what heals the mind, not pressure to be okay, not guilt for feeling anxious again, but the assurance that you are still held as this psalm settles into its final breath. There is no rush, no dramatic ending, just confidence that has been tested and found steady. Stay with me. The final words bring everything together and leave the heart resting where it belongs. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because peace is not something you chase. It is something you return to. Psalm 55 ends the same way it lived, not in noise, not in force, but in trust. David does not summarize his pain. He does not analyze his journey. He rests. That is the final lesson. After all the words, after all the fears named, after all the burdens released, the soul is finally allowed to be still. And I will trust in you. That is how it ends. Not with certainty about tomorrow, not with guarantees about outcomes, not with answers to every question. Just trust. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because your heart does not need to be fixed tonight. It needs to be held. You don't need to understand everything. You don't need to feel strong. You don't need to silence every thought. You need a place to rest. And Psalm 55 offers that place. David shows us that anxiety does not disqualify faith. Fear does not cancel trust. A heavy heart does not push God away. It draws him closer. This psalm does not rush you out of pain. It walks with you through it, slowly, safely, without pressure. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. And when anxiety returns, because sometimes it will, you now know where to go. You return, you release, you rest. Again, that is the rhythm of peace. Before we end, I want you to notice something. Right now, your breathing is slower. Your thoughts are quieter. Not gone, but gentler. That matters. Peace does not need to be loud. To be real, it only needs to be steady. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. And if you're still carrying something tonight, you don't have to carry it alone. Before you leave, take a moment and write one word in the comments. Just one. A word that names what you're releasing. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to justify it. Just release it, because the God who heard David is still listening, and he is holding you. Even now, rest here. You are safe. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because sometimes peace arrives quietly, and the mind doesn't trust it at first. You wonder how long it will last. You wonder if the calm is temporary. You wonder when the weight will return. Psalm 55 understands that hesitation. David does not demand constant peace. He accepts ongoing trust. That difference matters. Anxiety wants guarantees. Faith practices return. Return to God. Return to prayer. Return to release. Again and again. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because peace is not a finish line. It is a place you revisit. David does not describe a life without trouble. He describes a heart with direction. He knows where to go when the weight returns. And that knowledge changes everything. You don't need to fear anxious thoughts anymore. They are no longer a threat. They are a signal to return. Return to surrender. Return to trust. Return to the God who sustains you. Psalm 55 does not shame you for needing reassurance more than once. It invites repetition. Morning, midday, evening. This rhythm is not weakness, it is wisdom. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because wisdom does not demand emotional perfection. It creates spiritual safety. David learned that safety does not come from controlling circumstances, but from choosing trust consistently and slowly over time. That consistency reshapes the mind. Anxiety loses its authority. Fear loses its urgency. Thoughts lose their sharp edges, not because they disappear, but because they no longer decide where you stand. David stands in trust, and so can you. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. You are not failing, because you still feel things deeply. You are human. God does not ask you to stop feeling. He invites you to stop carrying everything alone. This psalm teaches you how to do that gently, without pressure, without force, without pretending, just honesty and return. As we prepare for the final closing, let this settle. You do not need to rush back into noise. You do not need to fill the silence. Silence is not empty. It is safe. And you are allowed to remain here a little longer. The psalm is not finished yet. Neither is the peace it brings. Stay with me. The final words will close the circle and leave your heart resting where it belongs. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because peace does not need to rush you forward. It invites you to stay. Psalm 55 ends without urgency, without spectacle, without noise. It ends the way a heavy heart needs. Quietly. David does not try to prove anything anymore. He does not defend his faith. He does not argue with his thoughts. He trusts. That is the final posture. Not certainty about tomorrow, not control over outcomes, not emotional perfection. Trust. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because trust is where the mind finally rests. Not because every question was answered, but because the weight was placed where it no longer crushes you. David's heart was heavy when this psalm began, pressed, overwhelmed, crowded with fear and unrest. But by the end, nothing dramatic happened. Life did not suddenly change. People did not suddenly become trustworthy. The future did not suddenly become predictable. But David changed. His grip loosened. His breathing slowed. His heart found ground. That is real peace. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of safety. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm, because safety does not come from controlling life. It comes from trusting God with it. And that trust does something powerful. It teaches your mind that it does not have to stay alert all the time, that it does not have to scan for danger constantly, that it does not have to prepare for every possible outcome. It can rest right here, right now. Psalm 55 gives your soul permission to stop trying so hard, to stop bracing, to stop holding your breath. You are allowed to exhale. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm. And when you return to your day or to your night, carry this with you. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are not weak. You are human, and you are held. The God who listened to David has listened to you. Every word, every silence, every trembling thought, and he has not turned away. So if the weight returns tomorrow, or later tonight, or in a quiet moment when you least expect it, you know what to do. You return, you release, You rest. Again, that is the rhythm of peace. That is the promise of this psalm. If your heart is heavy, listen to this psalm and let it bring you back to the place where your soul feels safe enough to be still. Stay here as long as you need. You are not alone.